Hello, good morning. Bom dia a todas e todos. Good morning from Brazil. My name is Cristine Severo. I'm going to mediate this presentation. This is the annual conference of the International Association for the Integrational Study of Language and Communication. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today. That is Professor Dr. Sangeeta Bagga-Gupta, who holds the professor chair in education with a multidisciplinary background at the School of Education and Communication in Jönköping University, Sweden, and has been professor chair since 2007 at Department of Education, Gender Studies and Rehabilitation Center at Örebro University, Sweden. Sangeeta is since 2017 the director of the LPS research environment and has been the scientific head of the research group CCD, which means Communication, Culture and Diversity, since the second half of the 90s. She has been director of two large-scale national doctoral schools between 2007 and 2015, Educational Sciences, Literacies, Multilingualism, and Cultural Practices in Present-Day Society, and has led a number of large-scale externally funded research projects. Sangeeta Bagga-Gupta initiated in 2016, together with the Swedish National Theatre and Örebro Theatre, the group DOIT, Participation and Inclusion Think Tank. Her communicative repertoires include multiple spoken, sign, and written languages. The title of her talk today is On Naming Traditions, Losing Sight of Communicative and Democratic Agendas When Languages Lose in Academic Landscapes. So, Professor Sangeeta, thank you very much for your virtual presence here today. Please, now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you for this space, for letting me share thoughts that I've been engaged with since the turn of the century. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is my second integrationism conference, integrationist epistemological stances. I am learning, in many ways, support my multidisciplinary theoretical-oriented work that has reflected on some paradoxes in the language scholarship in general, and how it plays out in the Swedish landscape more specifically. In addition to integrationism, I have more recently been studying contemporary writings on the communication theories of Sadharanikaram. There are interesting overlaps between these, and I will return to this issue. My presentation built in part on a chapter in a forthcoming Routledge handbook on language and Southern theory, edited by Kuiper, Mokoena, and Makoni. My paper also draws on some other sources, and in particular, a 2004 study in the Swedish journal Utbildning och Demokrati, that is Education and Democracy. This study was inspired by anthropologist Uni Vikans' sharp critique on how the scholarship in Norway was handling the concept culture. There, I argue that while this was the case in Sweden as well, it was also the same for this thing we call language. I will be happy to share these and other more recent writings with you, and also to dialogue with you at and after this conference. I've structured my presentation in roughly 4 parts. After some introductory remarks, I will spell out my epistemological leanings in terms of what I call a second wave of Southern perspectives. I then plan to present 3 illustrations that trouble contemporary ideas about language before I round up with some final remarks. While it is languages who co-create meaning and words become discourse in mundane interactions, naming traditions in the language scholarship continues to frame language in ways that builds on boundary markings. While issues pertaining to what language is, where it exists, who creates and sustains it, how it evolves, are understood to have, at least implicitly, engaged the language scholarship in northern spaces across time, we currently see an increasing problematizing gaze on the very notion of language in these spaces. Parallel concerns relate to whether dimensions of a problematizing gaze constitute new ideas or a new articulation based upon new ways of seeing. Calling into question the boundedness of named languages and social practices means that the meaning-making enterprise of human communication cannot be broken down into different types of units that are separated from other non-animate tools and resources without destroying the very nature of what the glossed-termed language stands for. The essentialization and nameability of what is understood as language lies at the core of this issue. This problematizing gaze relates in particular to what is glossed as multilingual people and multilingualism in northern places like Europe and in particular in Sweden. The renewed focus on the multilingual human condition has both replaced and/or expanded the previous focus on the concepts bilingual and bilingualism. While the terms bilingual and multilingual appear in large measure to be used interchangeably, more specific naming traditions have emerged in northern places. These include pluralism, translingual, translingualism, translanguaging, etc. While these naming traditions pay acknowledgement to the deployment of more than one named language, the prefixes bi, multi, pluri, and trans all reiterate the existence of separate bounded language units. For instance, the latest prefix trans in this domain too implies that separate language units exist that people move across in their communication. Drawing a parallel to earlier discussions on how the term culture replaced race in Scandinavian settings, and the ways in which it is loose in the streets of nation states like Norway and Sweden, I argue that boundary marking is loose and continues to haunt conceptualizations of language. It is people, rather than reified cultures, who meet and act. It is people, rather than named languages, who meet and interact. Thus, while it is languages who communicate with one another, understandings of language that dominate language scholarship continue to be built upon archaic images of words fixed in dictionaries, rules enumerated in grammar books, languages residing inside people's heads, etc. And for present purposes, importantly, naming traditions within K-12 and higher educational landscapes, including research. Making visible outcomes of boundary creations, including the nature of their fluidity and the implications of such visibility in language scholarship broadly, and on what is called language specifically, unearths tensions. It is this double-speak that is in need of redress. Systematically drawing attention to these tensions constitutes dimensions of justice and solidarity, where the agenda is to decenter single grand stories. A caveat here is that language understood in its communicative and meaning-making sense constitutes the very tool for discussing issues regarding a problematizing gaze. In other words, discussing the problems inherent with boundaries and the fluidity of languaging can only be attempted with the multifaceted key resource of language. It is this multifacetedness that needs to be kept in mind when zooming into the very naming traditions across societal and institutional spaces of higher education, including research and the K-12 educational landscape. Analytical framings that guide my discussion here build on alignments at the crossroads of theoretical framings that go under umbrella terms like dialogical, sociocultural, and decolonial perspectives, and that draw inspiration from non-mainstream theoretical framings regarding communication, like integrationism and sadharanikaran. I call these non-mainstream since these constitute unknown or new orientations in my settings. I will briefly present some key assumptions related to my discussion here within an overarching framework called the second wave of Southern perspectives, in short, SWASP. A SWASP framing marks ongoing trajectories of ideas, particularly in mainstream academic scholarship. It builds on multiple overlapping theoretical framings. The marking second wave in SWASP calls into focus, similar to the prefix post in post-colonial, that which came before, that is first. A first wave contributed to making visible a marginalizing, hegemonic colonial order of things as the naturalized order of things. It emerged primarily from philosophy, literature studies, critical studies, and rested on activist agendas. Scholarship that builds on empirical data and the processes that constitute marginalizing hegemonic stances on the one hand, and furthermore engages with mainstream scholarly domains on the other hand, can be seen as constitutive of a second wave. SWASP acknowledges the non-neutral agendas of knowledge production and circulations across time and space, and continues the work of creating a solidarity-based global-centric scholarship built on epistemic justice. It recognizes that colonial hegemonic stances are present in territories irrespective of their colonial heritage. An ongoing first wave of Southern thinking is backed by both challenge towards colonialism and awareness building of anti-colonial and post-colonial stances inside and outside scholarship. Thus, the lives and writings of Gandhi and the writings of the Trinity, Syed, Bhabha, Spivak can be seen as key in anti-colonial and post-colonial areas. Decolonial scholarship emerges particularly from South American spaces from the 1960s onwards. A SWASP framing takes a point of departure in this ongoing, non-linear trajectory of thinking, making relevant the continuing colonial order of things as the natural order of things, particularly in mainstream academic scholarship. It encompasses and intersects with theoretical frameworks where issues of communication are central. Recognizing the important work in the first wave, SWASP also attempts to eliminate the naturalizations of hegemonies in societal arenas at large. Thus, the premises that collate towards a SWASP framing emerge from different named theoretical positions that can be conceptualized as two clusters. Together, these clusters contribute to an understanding of communication or languaging as fundamental dimensions of human existence. From meaning-making performative standpoints, languaging cannot be reduced to sign systems or fractured semiotics. Neither can languaging be mechanically and or programmatically decoded, named, and categorized without flattening or destroying its complexity. Words and language are taken to constitute inseparable dimensions of the entanglement of signifying practices. An important SWASP caveat is that this premise relates to the language that scholars use in their explorations. That is how we scholars clothe a phenomena has significance. Thus, mundane languaging, as well as scholarly languaging, constructs and provides meaning and alignments. Such thinking calls for a methodological analytical stance wherein a researcher's mobile gaze constitutes a premise. Building on what I have recently discussed as a loitering gaze across disciplinary domains and empirical materials is thus fundamental to be able to leave aside programmatic methods and conceptual dogmas. Such loitering mind work cultivates sensitivity towards the work of words and the work of metaphors regarding language and other key concepts that mutually reinforce one another. It is, I am arguing, a researcher's loitering gaze that can enable highlighting the paradox of the increasing recognition accorded to the imagined nature of things like languages, the fluidity of human identities, and the shifting boundaries that recreate nation spaces. In contrast to the naming traditions that they fall back upon when describing language, identity, and nation spaces, which are saturated with connotations bounded, essentialized, and static. This premise draws attention to the need to disturb received knowledge and its sources. From whom, when, and where specific types of knowledge originate, what is meant by it, which others are aligned to it, how its premises are articulated, what a specific perspective is labeled as, etc. In some of my recent writings, I group these analytical ideas that contribute to SWASP framings into 4 groups. First, on time spaces. For instance, recognizing complex diversities of places wherein marginalizing and marginalized peoples and places coexist in contemporary places. Recognizing that alternative knowledges are not place-related enunciations, but rather concerned with the articulations of marginalized, invisibilized ideas and themes, that is, troubling single-grand stories. Second, on language. For instance, recognizing that language both creates boundaries and is a key resource and means to revitalize newer boundary spaces. Contributing towards multiple language ontologies and Southern multilingualisms that build on ideas, not places of enunciation. Recognizing that languaging is fundamentally a meaning-making enterprise with important communicative and democratic agendas. The largest group of tenets compose a third group, what I call a general theory methodology. These include aligning with theories that resonate with broader democratic agendas rather than using the most advanced or the most familiar theoretical framework as a straitjacket. Engaging with social practices and multi-layered messy data rather than with programmatic methods. For instance, people's accounts generally. Focusing complexity and heterogeneous entanglements rather than authentic, homogeneous ontologies. Contributing to an inclusive global stance with the intent of establishing global-centric, multiversal, and pluriversal knowledges. Troubling hegemonic northern gazes that uphold and reinforce majority privileged stances. Situating humans in entangled ecologies with non-humans. Expanding colonial marginalizations to include people and places marked by the economically disadvantaged, functionally othered, the minoritized, the racialized, etc. Cultivating a problematizing gaze from cross, inter, multi, transdisciplinary spaces in order to break the taken for grantedness of a rooted gaze from a given naturalized disciplinary stance, and so on. And fourthly, ideas that can be grouped as scholars and others' positionalities. For instance, recognizing that human mobility, including digitalization, constitute significant dimensions that dissolve hegemonies of place. Focusing issues related to the marginalizers, for instance, in terms of the entanglements of historically framed privileges, rather than only the marginalized, that is based on human characteristics. Explicating scholars' mobility-marked positionalities beyond their physical situatedness. So let me take up some examples now, using this epistemological gaze and the paradox that I have highlighted. My first example questions the planetary fixedness in scholarship and contrasts this with a global stance. This is related also to ongoing discussions on places and ideas of scholarly enunciation. Existing naming traditions that draw attention to territories on planet Earth build on various types of boundary marking and recognition processes. In addition to the existence of bounded continents, factual, mythical, hegemonic political processes recreate countries. Their current numbers are dependent on different types of counting criteria. For instance, the UN recognizes 195, the World Football Association FIFA lists 211, and 205 exist on the Olympics list. The 50-odd countries that existed 3/4 of a century ago, in large measure as parts of empires, have morphed into 200-odd nation-states or other administrative units. While shifting and somewhat hazy nature of boundaries create such geopolitical units, there exists a naming pluralism in how countries and territories get grouped into what is glossed as northern and southern or western and eastern. Over time, countries, regions, and empires termed as the East morphed in the scholarship and the common imagination into the South. These territories are also named variously as the Global South, the West, South-centric, Southern, the majority, etc., in contrast to North, West, the Global North, Northern, North-centric, etc. This terminological smorgasbord is marked by traditions related to anti, post, and decolonialism. In addition to the binary nature of naming traditions, the point that is relevant here is that this typology relates to territorial places, spaces, and metaphors linked to both the marginalized and the marginalizers. Such territorial and planetary-based directional naming trajectories are, however, slippery in the analytical enterprise. East or south of what? And west or north of what, one might ask? Marginalized in what directions? In what dimensions? By whom? When and where? Human mobility in general, and scholars' mobility specifically on the one hand, and digitalization-enabled mobility and access processes on the other hand, also draw attention to problems of fixing such terms into physical places on a spherical planet that spins in the known universe. Important implicit or explicit points of departure in the binaries, west-east, north-south, west-west, nevertheless relate to potent meaning-making traditions that map onto the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, and those who have the privilege to marginalize others, wittingly or unwittingly, based on their skin color, able-bodiedness on the one hand, and the marginalized on the other. In addition, the histories of colonializing and colonized peoples and territories draw attention to other naming traditions regarding place that circulate in discourses and that constitute potent tools for thinking inside and outside scholarship. For instance, developed, developing, underdeveloped, first, second, third worlds, etc. Going beyond territorial connotations, the scholarly problematizing gaze is often framed in terms of alternative knowledges, alternative epistemologies enabled by Southern or South-centric scholars, and scholarship thus calls for a global-centric naming arena. Such global-centric knowledge regimes attempt to make visible histories of marginalization, which at the same time opens up hegemonic stances to new ways of being within the scholarship and thereby acknowledges alternative epistemologies. This means that the agenda is not the replacement of a northern gaze or northern knowledge with a southern gaze or new knowledge, but a global recognition of multiverses. My second example critically unpacks the language education landscape of the nation state of Sweden, including higher education and research. It illustrates the key tension between more recent understandings of the fluidity and fuzziness regarding the nature of language and naming traditions that coexist in parallel. The research and educational landscape I draw attention to here builds on two primary ways that indicate the naturalized order of things: the relationship between different named languages and different named languages for different predefined identity categories. Naming traditions that build upon an institutional administrative division give rise to titles of higher educational departments where research is conducted and education is imparted. In the Swedish educational landscape, these include Swedish, English, sign language, Swedish as a second language, Swedish as a second language for the deaf, different foreign languages, etc. A key institutional administrative division that marks language scholarship relates to how specific named languages are earmarked for specific groups. This can be illustrated by the following in the Swedish national syllabus and our institutional departments. Swedish for ethnic Swedes, Swedish as a second language for ethnic minorities or immigrant students in schools, Swedish for adult immigrants, Swedish as a second language for the deaf, English as a second language for ethnic Swedes and ethnic minority Swedes, German as a foreign language for ethnic Swedes and ethnic minority Swedes, Turkish as a home language for ethnic minoritized or immigrant Swedish students, etc. Such a naturalized order of things contrasts with for the northern gaze, chaotic order of things I will take up with my final example shortly. But before that, I will draw attention to the naming traditions related to the terms bilingual and bilingualism. While a competency view of two named languages is recognized as being mythical, the misleading nature of this conceptualization is more hazily recognized. It is here that the monolingual spectre makes itself felt and continues at the norm that shapes people's individual and institutional lives. The naturalization of these demarcations creates essentialist identity framings for individuals and groups, and specific ontologies in relation to language itself. Thus, naming traditions with a numerical connotation, relational signification, geographical emphasis, gendered connotation, embodied norms build both on problematic reductionisms and contribute to losing sight of communicative agendas across spaces. While such naming traditions are part of linguistics, Chris Hutton argues that their status, and I quote, their status within organicist ideology and radical nationalist identity politics is forgotten or ignored. At the very least, it should be recognized that the rise of mother tongues, for instance, reflects a particular set of historical circumstances, not a trans-historical law of human identity formation, end quote. Furthermore, such naming traditions are pushed by a selective, individual-centered ontology concerning learning and development, a mythical monolingual native ethnic person, point of reference, and they exist in relation to an assumed static bounded conceptualization regarding a specified named language, in this instance, Swedish. Such a hegemonic gaze naturalizes languaging about language within institutional settings and shapes societal discourses in what Ian Hacking calls looping processes. My final example comes from the world's largest census exercise carried out every 10 years since 1881 in territories that today constitute India. A bird's eye view of this gigantic reporting across time illustrates an incongruence between hegemonic naming traditions and complexities that mark spaces. While the first census in post-independent India in 1951 listed 845 named languages, including dialects, the 1961 census tabulated 400 named languages within 4 major language families and included 1,652 mother tongues. The 2001 census recorded 122 named languages and 234 mother tongues. While demands to include 33 more named languages have been made recently, the 22 officially recognized languages encompass 93 mother tongues and are reported to be spoken by over 96% of the population. The 100 named languages called non-scheduled languages encompass another 141 mother tongues and are said to be used by 3.4% of the population. While the naming traditions in these censuses build on questions regarding people's reported bilingualism and mother tongues, the reporting raises the interesting issue of how named languages, bilingualism, and mother tongues are conceptualized in the tabulation processes across time. Furthermore, while the colonial entanglement of naming traditions in what is language cannot be ignored, a northern hegemonic cursory graze on these figures highlights that numbers don't tally. More mother tongues are reported as compared to named languages. Sense making in the analytical task here calls for freeing oneself from a mathematical framing wherein the norm is one named language equals one mother tongue. Shifts can also be discerned in what is meant by bilingualism and mother tongue since colonial 19th century. For instance, Professor of Social Linguists at Deccan University in Pune, Shailendra Mohan, and I have reported recently that while the census had a single question regarding an individual's single language between 1881 and 1921, a second question regarding any other Indian language spoken by an individual gets incorporated in the census between 1931 and 51. And from 1961 onwards, this question includes information about non-Indian languages used by citizens. We have also argued that how bilingualism gets framed in these exercises is at odds with the multiple named languages used by citizens in their daily lives. Secondly, Shailendra and I have looked at how the concept mother tongue gets discussed over time. Tabulations in 1881, 1931, 1941, and 1951 discuss mother tongue in terms of the language first spoken by an individual, while in 1891, the term used was parent tongue and not mother tongue. In 1901, the language ordinarily used was the term used. The 1971 census conceptualizes mother tongue as the language spoken in childhood by the person's mother to the person. If mother died, then language mainly spoken in the person's home during childhood was used. In 2001, the census workers are instructed to use the following guidelines as support to tabulate mother tongue data. And I quote, "The language spoken in childhood by the person's mother. If the mother died in infancy, the language mainly spoken in the mother's home in childhood will be the mother tongue. In the case of infants and deaf mutes, the language usually spoken by the mother should be recorded. In the case of doubt, the language mainly spoken in the household may be recorded," end quote. Shifts in conceptualizations regarding the ontology of language point to a variety of ways of talking about it. These shifts are not neutral processes. The term mother tongue was framed as parent tongue before it became fixed into a gendered position. The embodiment highlighted in this naming tradition, furthermore, situates language production in the mouth and its reception in the ear. Here, the holistic communicative dimensions of meaning making, including the meaning making work of silence and other embodiments, and also signs languages, where important foci of language production is on the hands and face, and reception in the eyes, are ignored. A scholarly gaze from a mobile position of being on the move, I have argued, has the potential to break the hegemonies of rooted traditions of analytical engagement from a given naturalized place or space. Received or hegemonically framed knowledge regimes about communication and language are not tied to the bounded place where a scholar is born in, or pays political allegiance to, or is employed at. Rather than the place of enunciation, it is, as Santos stresses, ideas of enunciation that evolve in struggles at boundary spaces, including scholars' trajectories of positionalities and socializations that are significant. Having said that, the need exists to recognize both historically marginalized explorations from positions of diversities and positionalities of Southern scholars and of the spaces of Southernisms across the global North and South that are important. A sense of knowing without clarity of enunciation becomes a given. I conclude by center staging such key sensitivities through an illustration from an essay in English titled The Advent of Satyagraha. Here, Mahatma Gandhi describes in 1928 the beginning years, 1906 to 1908, of one of the most critical dimensions of what evolved into the first anti-colonial and later global movement of nonviolence. And I quote, "None of us knew what name to give to our movement. I then used the term passive resistance in describing it. I did not understand the implications of passive resistance, as I called it. I only knew that some new principle had come into being. As the struggle advanced, the phrase passive resistance gave rise to confusion, and it appeared shameful to permit this great struggle to be known only by an English name." Gandhi goes on to describe how an open competition was announced in a national newspaper inviting suggestions on what to call the movement. He tweaked the term that was selected, satyagraha, meaning firmness in a good cause, into satyagraha, that is, the force which is born of truth and love or non-violence. This, he argues, led to the replacement of the term passive resistance in English with the word satyagraha, which has since then become a key global concept that cuts across named languages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sangeeta. That was a very inspiring presentation. We still have some time to interact with the audience. We have here together in the Zoom room, Professor Peter Jones and Professor Adrian Peble. If you feel like sharing comments or making questions, please do that. There is one comment in relation to the, to this conception of the proposal on second wave. Just 1 minute, let me check here in the chat. On the second wave idea, if it reinforces like a linear conception of Southern studies, if you could comment a little bit more on this perspective of first wave and second wave, that would be grateful. We would be grateful, thank you. We can't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. So, Christine, I just wanted to know, am I on the YouTube? Because I'd like to see in case people put up questions directly, or am I on Zoom, or should I stop sharing? I can't hear you now.
All right. Yes, you are both
Yes.
YouTube and here
Okay.
Zoom. So I'm bringing some interactions from YouTube, and we
Yes.
also, yes, we are here in the Zoom as well. I can put the link here of YouTube if you want to follow your presentation.
No, I'm there as well, so I just wanted to know. Okay. So what the question was on whether this is linear. No, I think I did mention that this is non-linear. It is not. It is not something that is taking place after something else, even though the term second wave kind of implies or suggests that. I am talking to the scholarship in my situated part of the world, which is Scandinavia, and where ideas of decoloniality are very vague. So I have to talk to the Holy Trinity, as I call it, Baba, Spivak, and Syed, who are taken up if people come to issues of post-coloniality. So post-coloniality continues to be understood in terms of something that does not concern us in places like Sweden. And the evolvement of a second wave tries to go beyond the ideas and the rationale, which is in anti, post, and decoloniality in some specific ways. One is the need to engage with empirical data. The others is to bring very clearly an understanding of ideas regarding communication and language from dialogical, sociocultural perspectives. And this is where I find integrationism as a very important inspirational area, but also Sadharanikaran, which is a theory, a very old theory of communication. And I'm just trying to grapple with understanding that. So I'll leave it at that, but I can come back onto what how the second wave or the SWASP framing is developing at the moment. So it's definitely not linear.
Thanks, Sangeeta. And could you also share your experience as in language education, if we consider the second wave perspective of a Southern epistemologist? How can, for example, we apply this perspective to the experience of language teaching and learning, for example?
Yeah, so in different parts of the world, you have different ways of conceptualizing language education, both at universities, but also in schools. The second example that I shared with you today was a critical unpacking of how that looks in the Swedish landscape, where, for instance, a subject area called Swedish has been compartmentalized to align with different identity positionalities. And a SWASP framing would allow us to see the incongruence between offering the subject Swedish as a second language to third or fourth generation immigrant students. So this is a very problematic way of understanding human identity positionalities by calling a child whose great-great-grandparents moved to Sweden as not being capable of studying Swedish. And there are entanglements of what learning becomes reduced to when this is done. So when groups of people get positioned as receivers of a particular kind of education. So in a setting like Sweden, this has a very major relevance. This also, of course, has relevance to how our university departments are constructed. So we actually have departments called departments of Swedish as a second language, and departments of Swedish as a second language for the deaf. So you have various assumptions that are not articulated, and what a SWASP framing would then encourage is the articulation of these underpinnings, so that we can then understand the need to be able to look at language education rather than look at education of these very compartmentalized study areas.
Thanks, Sangeeta. And there is another question from our colleague, Peter Jones, and a comment as well. Very interesting and powerful presentation, Sangeeta. Thank you very much. The census data you presented on a mother tongue was very interesting. What would you see as the political and ideological factors at work in those changing definitions of mother tongue, and where do you think things are going on that front at the moment?
I wish I had time to sit with Shailendra and actually discuss these at a more depth. So there is this colonial heritage. If we look at the 1881 census question, there is this idea that people can just have one language they speak, which is, of course, a complete crossroads with how people language. So when we look at that, and then we look at how that shifts to the inclusion of a second language, that continues to be at odds, because all my colleagues in outside of Sweden, outside of Europe, all my colleagues would find the issue of a single mother tongue as being at odds with their lived realities. However, this big census operation that takes a couple of years to put together, I don't see this coming up in areas such as asking for how many. And I don't think that is my point with this kind of analysis. I don't subscribe to the counting exercise either, but it's interesting, and it informs us about the colonial heritage of these kind of exercises. So we today have the possibility for a citizen in the nation state of India to be able to say that they have at least 3, so counting 3 languages. But colleagues I currently work with very clearly can count up to 7 or 8 different named languages. But I don't want to go down that path, because I don't think that is what is the meaning-making framing of languaging that I'm interested in. I wouldn't be able to guess as to where we are going as far as this accountability agenda is concerned. And I think that we need to also recognize that an exercise like a census, where 1.3 billion citizens are tabulated, could possibly not do the kind of sensitive and cannot be built upon the kind of reasoning and argumentation that a scholar can bring to bear. So I think we need to also recognize the limitations of using such examples.
Thanks, Sangeeta. There is another question. If we consider integrationism as a semiological framework, how far can we go in framing the complexities of language experience?
Yeah, and I have to say that I am becoming, I remember a year or 2 ago, or we were having an exchange, Peter and I, over mail, and I said that it was so refreshing to read scholars who are embedded in integrationism, and I find it so clarifying. And Peter, if I can quote you, you said that, oh, that was interesting because you find it very challenging. And I think I'm coming to that challenging phase, because I'm reading Rationality and the Literate Mind at the moment, studying Roy Harris, and I'm a bit challenged at some places with the way he unpacks the hegemonies of how we are, our embeddedness in language. And I share that concern, and I think I tried to bring that up in this presentation, that we need to understand that the only tool that we have to articulate our understandings of language is language. So there is that limitation, and research cannot go outside that. None of us can kind of put ourselves outside of our own boundedness in language. And there, I think I'd love to see some writings in integrationism where what is glossed as multilingualism gets discussed, because I think that is possibly one way of coming outside that. So I wouldn't dare say anything more. I'm still a student of integrationism.
Thanks, Sangeeta. So we still have some more minutes. I'd like to ask if you have something else to share with us, like your final words and remarks.
No, I'd just like to say that I'm very happy and very thankful for Sinfree, who at a meeting in Auckland a couple of years ago pointed to this group and pointed to this area of scholarship that I, for whatever reason, had no knowledge about. So I'm very happy to be discussing, collaborating, and meeting with scholars who have been working with integrationism for such a long time.
Sangeeta, since we still have some minutes, there are two more questions here. They are just coming up. So I'll ask you, okay? One is from Professor Cliff. Where are the returns associated with the naming of languages in education? For instance, is this not creating hierarchies and defending cultural interests for those who are Swedish?
That's absolutely my point. So if I understand your question, this is exactly the hierarchizing. There are, about 15 years ago, I mean, when one of my earlier texts at the end of the 90s in Swedish, when that became known at the Swedish national authorities for schools, the discussion came up that, okay, so do we even know how many students are studying Swedish as a second language? So there was this national mapping done. And one of the things that came up was that it was less than 30% of students in schools who should have been studying Swedish as a second language who were not studying that. And of course, a lot of other classroom-based ethnographies have shown that the kind of learning opportunities that are presented to students who are studying what is glossed as Swedish and then studying what is glossed as Swedish as a second language, there is a very different richness, or there is a poverty in one area of learning. So there is a hierarchy, and there is also a hierarchy in terms of the opportunities that students are afforded in classrooms. So I agree with what you're saying there.
Thanks. And the last comment here before we finish from Rosemary. We tend to think that there is only one way to think about language, but this is not the case, especially in decolonial linguistics, where we have examples of other ways of thinking about language. What if we spoke from Herianto about our current notion of language as we define it today? She makes a reference to Herianto 2007. So this is the last comment, if you would like to share your final words before we conclude.
So Rosemary, I'm sorry, I'll have to check up this reference. I'm not familiar with it, but that is a point that I'm trying to raise, that there isn't one way of understanding language. 2010, when I started, I had a visiting professorship at Aligarh Muslim University, and my colleagues there at the Department of Social Linguistics kind of made me understand that you can't talk about mother tongue in the way that I am used to talking about mother tongue. Even though I grew up multilingual, I still had this notion as a scholar that that mother tongue is in the singular. Mother tongue is supposed to be the many different ways of living with different named languages. That is our mother tongue. So there are different conceptualizations. And my second example that I shared on the census, that kind of shows exactly, or sorry, the third example, that shows exactly this, that there are different ways of understanding what language is. And instead of exporting this hegemonic way of understanding language that exists in the global north, we need to try and be open to understanding other ways of understanding language. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Professor Sangeeta. So I would just like to remind everyone to visit the channel and to follow the next presentations, the future talks of this conference. Thanks a lot. See you. Bye-bye.